Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody.
Morning.
We're very happy to start the third session of this year conference on quality of architecture. It's a pleasure. This session will be conducted by Li Xiangnin and myself, and welcome everybody. I have to say that this 2022 International Conference follows last year. That the title of it was On the Duty and Power of Architectural Criticism. And for this following up and all the work that it entitles, I wish to congratulate Wilfred Wang. And this year, in association with Jose Manuel Pozo, that is also here, of the Universidad de Navarra. Today, we will have the theme, Defining Architectural Quality, with a keynote speech by for Matsipa and the presentations of Marta Peixoto and Mara Vitru. We welcome all of you, and we look forward to that. But before presenting the first speaker, I would like to say a few words on the general theme and on today's presentation. This presentation will not only deal with defining architectural quality and the reality of the architecture, but also with the invisible and intangible. On a first approach, it might seem contradictory to talk about a real object and its intangible meaning, but our three presenters will manage with success, I am sure. Let me add that in the previous 2 days, meaning Saturday and Sunday of last week, we have been talking about material quality, social quality, intellectual quality, that made me think of a personal concern expressed last year. And I entitled my small paper, The Power to Behold, and of the importance to see and study firsthand the architectural work and not to express opinions and qualifications only through the appreciations of image, plans, and archives. For this, I commend Marta Peixoto and Mara Vitru for their personal approach to the buildings they present. 2 houses in Brazil of well-known architects and the work of Takis Zenetos confronted with Carlos Carpa. But the presentation by Matsipa is another substance that the title showcases, the uninhabitable. Uninhabitable, sorry. And subtitle, Appearances of the Invisible Architecture and Urbanism. So that's very enticing, and we're really looking forward to it. And she confronts manifestations, realities, and situations, especially in South Africa. So let me introduce her. She is an educator, researcher, and curator, and she has been a Chancellor Fellow at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa in 21-22, and recently a Loeb Fellow at the Graduate School of Design in Harvard University. She has delivered talks globally and taught advanced studio, history, and theory of planning and architecture in the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Witwatersrand, the Copper Union in Columbia University. She was a co-investigator on an Andrew Mellon research grant on mobilities and has written critical essays on art and architecture and curated several exhibitions and discursive platforms, including the 14th International Exhibition at the Venice Biennale in 2008. She's chief curator of African mobilities at the Architecture Museum in Munich and Studio X in Johannesburg in South Africa. She's currently an associate curator from Lubumbashi Biennale and working on a publication project of African mobilities that it's related again to what she will present today. Please welcome, join me in welcoming her, and the floor is yours. Go ahead. Happy to hear you.
There we go. Thank you so much, Louise, for a great introduction. And thank you also to Wilfred Wang for this invitation to participate in a dialogue on the question of architecture and quality. Is it okay if I screen share? Yeah. Keynote. Sorry.
If you go to share screen,
Yeah,
and the green rectangle, and
I've got it. Yeah, but I can't quite find.
you need to open your PowerPoint first, and then press share screen.
Okay, let me see if this is successful.
If you continue to have problems, I have opened your presentation.
Okay.
I can open for you.
I am having problems.
Okay, let me open then. Can you see your presentation?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Tell me, just say next, and I'll press the button.
All right, will do. Thank you so much, Wilfred.
You're welcome.
All right. So again, thank you for this invitation to participate in a dialogue on the question of architectural quality. I have to be honest, I was puzzled to be asked to reflect on this question, because so much of my work as a curator and also as a theorist is grounded in a fundamental questioning of the definition and criteria that are brought to bear on what constitutes a worthy subject of architectural inquiry, particularly within established canons of architectural and urban theory in the global north. I should mention that when I was conceptualizing and putting together my slides, I was actually in Lubumbashi, with the second largest city in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Katanga region that produces the world's largest supply of copper and cobalt that is powering the green energy transition in the global north, where we were actually exploring the theme of toxicity, a thematic that links extractivism, the environmental and notions of the city. If the longue durée of colonial extraction serves as a marker for reading the city, then Lubumbashi is its poster child, a precursor of the conditions for making life rendered everyday life precarious, while quietly powering capitalist growth elsewhere. So I can't think of a better place to think about questions of quality, life, and inhabitation than from a site that many regard as one of the killing fields of capitalist extraction, and a resource for the green energy transition that occupies so much discursive space in the global north. What is at stake here? So different authors have conceptualized the epistemological crisis that locations like Lubumbashi or Africa pose in Western scholarship. In a sense, these scholars highlight some of the conceptual limitations of Western scholarship for understanding the rest of the world. Firstly, through making universal claims against which these cultures, locations, and spaces are measured. And secondly, through the conceptual, temporal, and geographical difference, which is understood as distance. I turn now to Edward Said, who makes a very compelling argument about imaginative geographies of Orientalism. Edward Said explores what it means to be a subject in context of instability and crisis. According to Said's Orientalism, produced both positive knowledge about the so-called East and also second-order knowledge, stereotypes, mythologies, and tropes that had a life of its own, of the mysterious, dangerous, exotic Orient. Said defines imaginative geography as a fictive process, a rudimentary classification system through which geographic as well as cultural, social, ethnic, and cultural differences are circumscribed by a range of suppositions, associations, and fictions. Orientalizing the Orient, argues Said, entails a confirmation of what is already known rather than unsettle already firm convictions. These domestications or attempts at domesticating the so-called exotic are produced through the imposition of a limited vocabulary and imagery. It is in this spirit that one might begin to encounter German modernist aesthetics in the build. On the other hand, an African theorist, Achille Mbembe, thinks about this conundrum of how the non-West appears in Western scholarship as invisibility and hypervisibility. So Mbembe argues that Africa has largely been defined and understood through a negative interpretation and points to a dearth of discourse about Africa for itself. And here is Mbembe, whom I'm quoting. The simplistic and narrow prejudice persists that African social formations belong to a specific category, that of simple societies or of traditional societies, unquote. And these simple societies and traditional societies are defined by facticity, arbitrariness, timelessness, and Africa is used as a sign of non-being, of nothingness, and of lack. So this is what I mean when I talk about invisibility. Mbembe allows us to engage further with this question of temporality through his concept of entanglement. However, before he introduces us to this idea of simultaneous multiplicities, he outlines the ways in which representations of Africa are often caught between the kind of epistemic closure. Africa is nothing on the one hand, and on the other hand, the forms of knowledge produced are invested in a kind of social engineering rather than actual knowledge production. This relates specifically to a large swathe of developmentalist literature around African spaces, which presupposes a teleological path for Africa and a desired convergence between Africa and the rest of the so-called developed world. Nevertheless, I want to begin by reflecting on the ways in which African architecture, art, and urbanism appears in conversations on quality. From an art historical perspective, on connoisseurship in African architecture and art can be located in early studies of ethnographic anthropology, collections that anthropologists used to illustrate how African society worked, and the fact that these fields did not recognize that these objects had aesthetic value, as argued by Carl Eisenstein through his publication on Negaplastique in the 1920s, W.E.B. Du Bois, Alan Locke, and Alfred Barr. These studies relied on European aesthetic values that were treated as a universal parameter, but they at least recognized its aesthetic value in servants of theorizing European modernity. They sought to universalize European modernity, and these arguments of European art served to construct universalist ideas regarding modernism and modern art. On the other hand, Itohan Osaime Mwesi argues that German colonial encounters with African architecture produced an aesthetic awareness that informs German modernist aesthetics and the built environment. According to Itohan, German colonial architects amassed vast knowledge of non-Western subjects and regions, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific during colonial expeditions, international exhibitions, and trade and travel literature that stimulated progressive architectural thinking and shaped the emerging modern language of architecture within Germany itself. In Gone Primitive, Savage Intellectuals' Modern Lives, Mariana Togonovich too acknowledges the deep need for the primitive within Western modernity, as well as signaling the engendered qualities of the primitive as coeval with the unknowable feminine. Constructions of the primitive existed in early stages of psychoanalysis and anthropology, projecting their sense of alienation onto the world outside their own cultures. Furthermore, art historians such as Ikem Stanley Okoye redefine the origins of African modernism, where he argues that there are other ways of understanding the modern outside of the history of Western modernity. Next slide, please, Wilfred. Next, okay, thank you. So an example of the Global South. So one of the things that I wanted to start with in terms of thinking about ways of encountering simultaneous multiplicities was through thinking through the reuse and the recycling of existing buildings. And this in some ways relates to the struggle around producing an architectural vocabulary and a language that accounts both for histories of extraction and colonialism, but also finding ways to inhabit those spaces of borrowing, reuse, and modification. So one such example comes from Ecuador, which begins to, and it's a case study of a house that is called the House of Flying Beds by El Borda that was constructed between 2015 and 2017. So El Borda is a Quito-based studio and an architecture collective that reconstructed an old, dilapidated 18th century house in the town of Ibarra in Ecuador. The project attempts a contemporary reconfiguration and re-inhabitation of a deteriorated colonial-style architecture that was overhauled for a family. The old house had damaged floors, rotting roof structure, and the only things that seemed to be in a more or less salvageable were the walls of the single-story 80 square meter building. So this house is for a family with a large circle of friends. So the project focused on communal living areas with the open kitchen, living room, and dining room, plus the bathroom taking up the ground floor for shared use. So this is an interesting project for me because it aims to rehabilitate a home where the structural walls are reinforced, rammed earth surfaces were treated, and doors and windows were updated. Walls were painted white with polished concrete on the floor to update the windows. And I think the architects retained the open plan layout of the main ground floor space and took advantage of the double height ceiling in order to suspend the home's 3 beds from the ceiling. It's interesting for me precisely because it begins to suggest an aesthetic of recycling, where roof tiles were so badly damaged that instead of being reused, that they were used for infill for the patio, and in their place, the designers opted to turn old rubber tires into roof tiles. A recycled glass ridge along the top of the roof line brings in light and reflects it through the different types of reclaimed glass in the interior. And the design team from El Borda went from local tradition in the selection of materials and endeavored to keep the renovation work to a bare minimum. So they shored up the bearing walls, repaired the rammed earth parts, replaced the doors and windows that couldn't be saved, and added a new polished concrete floor. So this is a really interesting example for me when I was thinking about questions of architectural quality and connoisseurship, and also these conversations around what does it mean to think through like what is modern from a non-Western perspective, and the ways in which these architects have been able to re-inhabit and reimagine what seems to be a kind of a fossil from a previous era. And this is how I begin to think about the ways in which a city like Johannesburg has been transformed quite radically, where a new set of uses, a new kind of imaginary has to deal with a set of pressures that didn't exist when the original structure was conceived. I want to move to a different scale of thinking about invisible geographies through 2 case studies, though, and this is the next slide, please. So I want to move to a different scale of thinking about invisible geographies through 2 case studies. The first is Aisha Balde's speculative project titled The Territory in Between. And the second one is a science fiction speculative graphic novella produced by an architect and a writer, Olaleka Njefus and Wale Lawal. but I'll begin with Aisha Balde's drawings. Balde's drawings appropriate a geographical and cartographical system made up of a hypothetical location. And Aisha Balde is the daughter of refugees who found themselves in South Africa in the 1990s. And her thesis project was really an attempt to redefine home. And what I'm trying to explore here is this idea of like a fugitive geography, and that rather than assuming that site is given, and a site that one can then use to determine architectural quality, these kinds of projects are really about the crisis around locating site when one occupies a space of crisis and flux. So Balde's drawings appropriate a geographical and cartographical system made up of a hypothetical location that produces an indeterminate terrain and locates an elusive liquid geography. Rather than colonizing the territory of the ocean through surveys and inventory, Balde marks an otherwise vast and seemingly empty surface with a series of notations and inscriptions and numbers that uncover hidden spatial relationships through a range of cartographic procedures of selection, schematization, and synthesis, which make the map, the territory, and the site already a project in the making. So on this site that is situated 22.5 kilometers off the coast of Cape Verde, Ghanaian architect Aisha Balde explored the interplay between physical and imagined spaces in ways that allow us to rethink our understanding of state, boundary, and space. Through drawings, Aisha probed fluid notions of territory, exploring the in-between spaces that contradict what she considers to be its two conventional underpinnings of site and state. According to Balde, while state often refers to an organized political community under one government, it also denotes one's condition at any given time. The project thus considers the tension between the formation, contestation, and contradictions of territories and the maintenance of edges and borders. Through this imaginative mapping exercise, Aisha was able to conceptualize an imagined site as a pit stop, a way station for migrants on their journey home from an unknown destination. Next slide, please. On the other hand, Mad Horse City, a project conceptualized by Wale Lawal and Olalekan Jafis, is an outgrowth of Lekan Jafis's Shantytown megastructure that constitutes an inversion of the visual grammars of a mythic Western modernity. Understood as infrastructure and technological innovation in order to produce new symbolic orders imbued with both sensorial and political experiences that heighten the visibility of some of the most marginalized urban populations in Lagos. So this is a graphic novella that Lekan and Wale produced for African Mobilities in 2018 that really was a contestation of hyper-development in Lagos and the ways in which the majority of the city's population were invisibilized by a kind of boosterist discourse. And so this kind of speculative rendition of Lagos in the near future is really sort of pushing the possibilities and the reality of toxicity in the landscape, of extraction, and the ways in which the majority population has been marginalized, and turning it into this massive, lurid, hyper-visible representation of the parts of Lagos that developers would rather have us unsee. So whereas Charles Davis III argues that Jafis synthesizes the mega infrastructural scale and technological themes of post-war architectural utopianism with the nuanced interpretations of the everyday, I would like to argue that what this work, Akura Kuda, begins to do is it stakes out Black spaces in the future and demonstrates distinctive statements about modernization and oppression as co-evil. So whereas the idea of Western modernity is about infinite progress, what Akura Kuda of Lagos in the near future begins to suggest is that, in fact, rather than being this kind of teleological movement of convergence, what modernity has meant in a site like Lagos is environmental degradation and toxicity in the environment that fundamentally begins to change the DNA of the people who live there. So for Balde and for Mad Horse City or Akura Kuda, sight is a mediated state of being that is constituted through an engagement with a simultaneous multiplicity of things and temporalities. Balde's mappings, like Mad Horse City's VR sets or Akura Kuda, suggest stages suggestive vehicles of various possibilities. They map alternative itineraries for modernity, subverting dominant spatial readings of place, state, and bureaucratic power. These sites are contingent, ephemeral, vague, characterized by the fugitive eventfulness of spatial experience that are foregrounded over the dominant disciplinary gaze. As argued by James Corner, the superimposition of various independent layers of space and time produce a heterogeneous and thickened surface. The mappings, the representations, and sets array an enabling topography, producing a stratified amalgam of relationships amongst disparate parts. The composite field is one of multiple parts and elements, a field of multiple orders through techniques of multiplicity, montage, and hybridization. The layered field remains open to numerous interpretations, uses, and transformations. Next slide, please. So I shift now to Johannesburg, which is the city where I grew up and where a lot of my teaching work happened over the last 12 years. And just to give a sense of the ways in which Blackness also constitutes a kind of invisibility in the production of the colonial city. So this is a slide of South Africa, which is on the southern tip of Africa, and an early 1896 map of downtown Johannesburg. And for me, what was really interesting when I started doing archival research on the origins of Johannesburg is that the history of the city actually begins with a story of Eetvalgrond, which is basically leftover territory after the colonial encounter. So there is no history of this territory before that precedes the arrival of settler colonialism in South Africa. But what I thought was really fascinating about this is the ways in which mapping technologies actually produce a kind of disappearance of earlier periods of inhabitation of the city. So what we don't learn by looking at these maps of South Africa that are really a sort of document of racialized dispossession is that there was a city that existed on the same location in the 15th and 16th century that had a population of about 20,000 people. So there's a way in which mapping technologies, modernist technologies, become a mode of disappearance. Wilfred, if you can please just go through, next slide, please. And then this is really a kind of history of disappearance in downtown Johannesburg, where the shift from segregationist residential segregation in the pre-war period was then followed by a complete modernization of segregation in the apartheid period and the modernization of the Group Areas Act. So the diagram on the left shows a kind of distribution of Black inhabitation in downtown Johannesburg, and the diagram on the right shows the ways in which Black residence was actually progressively disappeared in Johannesburg from about 1936 until about the 1980s. Next slide, please. And here at an architectural scale, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is the servants' quarters, which are described as, like the servants' quarters in the sky or the township in the sky, where even the appearance of Black bodies in a city like Johannesburg was codified as a present absence. So you would have a luxury apartment, and this is actually an apartment that I live in now. So I found these plans of the apartment building when I was renovating it, is that you have a luxury apartment that was designed in the 1950s that has like all of the modern amenities. And on the rooftop of this apartment building is an array of servants' quarters that are inward looking and that have no windows that look into the exterior. So there is a kind of policing of the visibility of Black bodies in a colonial city like Johannesburg, where the class of servants are so central to the functioning of the building, but there's a kind of architectural complicity in producing their invisibility on an everyday basis. So these registers of unseeing Black occupation in the city happen both at a metropolitan scale and also at the scale of the building. So what you see but through this Ernest Cole photograph on the right is that the window for the servants' quarter is above eye level, so that the person who's occupying the space cannot look out. So there's a kind of inversion of the ways in which Black bodies occupy space. So the spatial codification of the inner city, and the will to kind of invisibilize Black bodies in the city is something that carried through into urban renewal in downtown Johannesburg in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And this spatialization and codification of the inner city through urban renewal played an important role in forming a sense of place through understanding belonging and non-belonging in space. It also represented the inner city as an unknown territory to be explored in preparation for the projection and subsequent emplacement of a new public-private order in the form of city improvement districts. So, Wilfred, if you can please go to the next slide. That there's a very long history. Basically, what I'm talking about the argument that I make is that understanding domestic arrangements is also very important for understanding the way in which public space is constituted. And so the location of Black people within domestic space as hidden, as subjugated, as being sort of like edited out of the field of vision is also the way in which it begins to set up the codes through which public space is understood. So Black bodies are a present absence, or they are a present absence in the sense that they're there, but that they remain unseen. So on the left-hand side is the ways in which African male servants who are employed in paid domestic work were presented in the public space. But on the right, which is in the early 1900s, are the ways in which city officials were actively working to remove Africans from the inner city using discourses like sanitation and hygiene. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I'm linking and thinking historically about in terms of this question of disappearance is by following the work of Mary Sibande. And this was a public art project that was produced in 2010, where you have the sudden reappearance of a Black woman in domestic worker gear, plastered on and wrapped around decaying buildings in downtown Johannesburg. So this public art installation that was curated by Leslie Perkis features the work of Mary Sibande, who is an award-winning visual artist. But essentially, it's a very interesting, for me, engagement with the ways in which masking works in downtown Johannesburg. So if you look at the image on the left, and the title of this artwork is called "The Wait Goes On." The wait is so long, and the overall exhibition was called "Long Live the Dead Queen." The tension between lightness and weight, hypervisibility and spectralization, resulted in an unresolved play between masking and disclosure of the dispossessed and displaced urban residents and the urban fabric. They imagine freedom and containment within the structures of domination. So Mary Sibande's artwork sets up an unsettling mode of perception because the composite representation of the maid disrupted the hierarchical racial binary between the Black maid and the white lady madam. So she's in this kind of fantastic Victorian gown, which is a kind of the simultaneous multiplicities I was talking about. So on the one hand, she's represented as this kind of figuration of abjection, of loss, of absence. But on the other hand, is completely draped in this kind of imperial gown. And that speaks in some ways to the modes in which urban renewal in downtown Johannesburg has happened. So by unifying these racial categories into a single body, blurred the distinction between inside and outside, imbued with deep ambivalence. Chela Sandoval, an American theorist of post-colonial and third world feminism, describes these relations of interior and exterior as a set of inversions of a chiasmatic change in signification, a twisted trope that makes meaning by turning in on itself, by repeating while simultaneously inverting the relationship between the two concepts. In this conception of racial binaries, skin functions as a mask rather than as a mere surface. It is a material and bodily form that cannot fully disappear, even if it is disguised as a present absence. Sandoval claims that the concept of double consciousness arises out of this interstitial space, as also defined by W.E.B. Du Bois, James Walden, Frantz Fanon, Audre Lorde, Gloria Anzaldúa, Paula Gunn Allen, and Tintin Minha. The intermediate space between the skin and the mask also enabled indeterminate forms of being, and original practices of emancipation are produced. Thus, the process of masking produces a vertigo effect through a dual process of mimicry, in which appearances are stimulated on both sides of the mask, in which processes of masking are also often necessary for survival under conditions of domination. So I turn now to discussion on the uninhabitable. The uninhabitable, as argued by Abdul Malik Simone, is a way of seeing how specific urbanization processes constitute what Michel Foucault calls the underground acts of existence. Those practices and desires that are aimed neither at furthering life nor at institutionalizing settled forms of recognition. Building on the reflections of Catherine McKittrick, Abdul Malik Simone refers to the concept of uninhabitability to suggest that there are forms of urban life that do not fundamentally center on or concern possibilities of inhabitation. And here I'm quoting him. Even though urbanization is driven by human activity, it entails intersections of materials, things, and times that assumes unanticipated disposition that produce eventfulness and potentialities that do not so much foreclose residency as continuously shift what it means to reside, what it means to instantiate a sense of home or position, unquote. So this image of Mary Sibande is on the foreground, but what I want you to pay attention to is the image in the background, which was actually an old textile factory in the 1950s and 1960s that through a process of white flight and racial abandonment in the 1980s and 1990s became a space of habitation for some of the poorest people in the inner city area. So people who are involved in recycling, who cannot afford rentals in apartment buildings, would simply set up temporary structures within these factory buildings and turn them into a kind of home. And this is where I begin to think about this question of like those spaces in the city that might be regarded as uninhabitable that are then become serviceable to a form of inhabitation of the city that doesn't conform to conventional notions of domesticity. So one of the questions that I have as somebody who's interested in researching urban environments is what kinds of vocabulary do we bring to making sense of rapid urban transformation, of migration of large numbers of people who are largely impoverished into the inner city? And what is the value of questions of architectural connoisseurship in a state of crisis? Does it demand a new set of criteria, a different kind of vocabulary? Or do those categories, are those categories brought to bear on here? And what kind of spatial effects does it produce? So this question of quality is actually quite fundamental in thinking through the future of cities in Africa, in my opinion, particularly because, you know, the Western industrial city is presented as an object of desire. But that object of desire also demands the disappearance of unwanted Black and racialized and gendered bodies. So there's a fundamental contradiction between the kind of desire for modernity and the appearance of racialized and gendered bodies within the inner city. And one of the things that I also wanted to demonstrate, please, if you can go to the next slide, and the next, I think it should be animated, and the next, is that the inner city is animated by hypermobility. So there are large numbers of people moving in and out from the entire region of Southern Africa, and it's producing its own set of maps and trajectories that haven't been fully mapped or understood. So what I'm beginning to think about is, rather than questions of architectural quality, to think about maps as technologies that seek to locate and pin bodies down, and also the refusal of urban residents to be pinned down and located. So while maps can locate, and we can read them because they come laden with conventions ranging from their legend, scale, codes of graphic representation, to what counts as the information that they represent, they depend on a system of notation or coordinates that places things in relation to each other. Thus, maps serve as the interpretations of information. However, we often see them simply as representations and descriptions of space. The spaces that maps try to describe can be ideal, psychological, virtual, immaterial, or imaginary, and they are never just physical. However, according to Laura Kurgan, maps also risk offering only two alternatives. They let us see too much and hence blind us to what we cannot see, imposing a quiet tyranny of orientation that erases the possibility of disoriented discovery, or they lose sight of all the other things that we ought to see. They omit, according to conventions, those invisible lines of people, places, and networks that create the most common spaces we live in today. Thus, maps put the project of orientation, visibility, location, use, action, and exploration into question. It seems to me, therefore, before we arrive at any a priori criteria for quality, one needs to attempt to produce mappings, fluid mappings at the intersection of art, architecture, activism, and geography. They will uncover the implicit biases of the new views. They can be used to document, memorialize, preserve, interpret, and politicize, or simply as aesthetic devices. As with all data sets and the technologies used to chart them, they are not neutral. The uninhabitable also refers to ensemble work, collective lives of continuous remaking, where the rootedness of a sense of a we within the territorial emplacement and identification both exceeds these parameters and continuously posits new intersections among the ways in which the material operations of urban space are composed. Furthermore, the changing ensembles of the marginal drive the continuous reinvention of capitals across the global South. So as argued by Simone, and by way of closing, he argues that in his text, Improvised Lives, Rhythms of Endurance in an Urban South, Simone draws on the logics of great Black music and how they were mobilized to examine how ensemble works constitute a particularly salient mode of managing terrains of uninhabitable, rather than focus on the conventional tropes of political mobilization or collectivities rooted in clearly delineated identities or territories of belonging. Ensemble work, as argued by Simone, constitutes a convergence of disparate technicities and soundings, capable of playing the same notes and the same score, but generating entirely different trajectories or sonic possibilities. And so for me, the way, one of the touchstones for understanding that in some ways the unmappability or the unstable mappability of a place like downtown Johannesburg is by looking at Amabodo. So these are advertising boards that are carried by migrant women in downtown Johannesburg, advertising Black hairstyling, Black hairstyles and hairstyle salons in some of the abandoned and reconfigured spaces of the inner city. And when I first encountered them, I simply read it as a kind of a scrambling of the codes that blurs the distinction between what is global and what is local, because you have photographs of local women wearing contemporary hairstyles and also images of like well-known American celebrities also sporting equally glamorous hairstyles. But what I then understood by engaging Amabodo, the women who advertise these hairdressers, is that they actually serve as ciphers and a map of downtown Johannesburg. So each photograph is linked, or each group of photographs is linked to a hairdresser who occupies a space in an abandoned building in downtown Johannesburg. So these women have an intricate spatial understanding of a kind of fractal geography that is both horizontal and vertical of the inner city, that is presented and represented through Amabodo. And this to me begins to present a different way of reading and understanding the city that is tied to a set of aesthetic practices, aesthetic modes, a set of affective relationships, and also a kind of complex geographical understanding of the city as both horizontal and vertical that is constituted through gendered practices of beauty. So for me, the question of what does it mean to define architectural quality in a space of disappearance is more of an invitation to be experimental in the ways in which we read emergent and fluid and fugitive landscapes than simply trying to foreclose and universalize what architectural quality might actually mean. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very interesting and, of course, very, very rich intervention what you gave us. And my first immediate reactions have to do with all the multiplicities you are signaling and how they convey but encounter and also clash with the European aesthetic values and how there's, and I think it's right, I've been hearing about the global South. Now I hear the global North, and then it makes sense also. But I think it's complicated to try to understand each other. So for this, I think your the last part that has to do with the complication of mapping, the necessity of fluid mappings, has to do with one of your final phrases that I liked very much that says fluid and fugitive landscapes. And I think in inner cities like Johannesburg or many other inner cities, this is a reality that has to be faced with, and that showing hairdressers or other qualities, it's important to understand part of this urbanism. But I let the floor to Li Jiangning that will also give his reading on your presentation, and then we will open the floor to the members present.
Okay, so it's a great pleasure for me I think to listen to this wonderful presentation, and I think I have two observations. One is, about the architectural history and the narrations in the history and theory, as we are all members of SICA, and I think there's never an equal and fair positions in the narrations of world architecture, as we could find in the earlier edition of Bannister Fletcher's History of Architecture. He drew a map of maybe a drawing of a tree of architecture, and he put of course the root and of the main trunk from the Western architecture, maybe Greek and maybe Roman origins, and then the other parts of the world, the narrations of their architecture are only branches and maybe small apples on the tree, like Chinese, Japanese, and Indian and American, of course, as well as African. So today we understand that the world of architecture is not only one tree, but there are different trees in a post-colonial context, and there are there's even a forest other than one tree. So that is the real world. I think the second observation is about the conditions of contemporary human bodies. Different parts of the world are experiencing different, playing a different position in the process of urbanization. As in Europe, in Germany, and many other countries, you are experiencing shrinking cities, while in China and other parts of in like Korea, you still see the growth of urbanization and immigration of rural people to the city. So, and there are a lot of undergrounded people that their life and their visibility is not seen in the narrations of urbanism and presentations of urban spaces. So I think that this is really a very rich thing. I think I read David Harvey in his book, The Condition of Postmodernity, and he talked about compression of time and space and different different time and different spaces for different people in the different parts of the world. When the city means, stability and a home for somebody, at the same time, there are other people who feel the city is dangerous and unsafe, and they are flowing from one city to another city, as you could see in our part, China and the many other Asian cities. So I think I am very interested in the research and the exhibition you created, you call the African Mobilities. Can you say a little bit more about that part of your research? So give us a little more information about that research. I'm very interested. This reminds me of a Chinese artist's work whose name is Chen Zhen, who unfortunately passed away when he was still young. But he had a work called it's a image photo collage. It's called Two Cities, that he put the images of the cities, the two images of Shanghai together. One is the image of the skylines of Shanghai, as you can see, the high rise. But the other images are the people at the everyday and grassroots kind of everyday urbanism that in every corner, even the unseen part of the citizens. So I think I'm very interested in your research. Can you say a little bit about your research, African Mobilities?
Thank you very much for your comments, both Louise and Lee. I'm not familiar with Chen Zhen's work, but I'd be very interested to learn more about it. I think that the African Mobilities Project is something that I worked on with the director of the Architecture Museum in Munich, Andres Lepek, from 2017 until 2019. And the premise was really sort of looking at the ways in which a lot of media, particularly around 2016 and 2017, was really concerned with the large numbers of African people who were crossing the Mediterranean, seeking refuge in European cities. And what I understood at that moment, and it also happened at a moment when South African universities were in a state of upheaval because students were demanding a decolonization of the curriculum. So on the one hand, you had this kind of hyper focus on African and Eastern European migration into the capitals of the global North. That was really an exaggerated concern because the majority of circulation and migration that happens by Africans is within the African continent itself. So the mission for me was really to invite African and African diasporic designers and theorists to imagine and to theorize and to represent what it means to live in a world of motion. And to imagine the future of cities in Africa that also accounts for the fact that there is this hypermobility that a lot of our vocabularies around architecture and urbanism don't allow us to account for, because so much of the representation is about calculability, fixity, stability. And yet we're confronted with a period in time when there is massive migration of people across different boundaries. So African Mobilities had platforms in about 7 different cities. We had workshops, public conversations, thought experiments, creative experiments, and collaborations between visual artists, geographers, and architects to represent their interpretation and their visions of what the future, what African spatial futures might be. So the graphic novella and the speculative work produced by Lekan, Olalekan Jafis, and Wale Lawal was one iteration of how a collaboration in Lagos turned out, whereas a collaboration in Harare was work between a Zimbabwean, Zambian, and South African artist and architect collective that basically remapped the Southern African region, looking at the railway station and the ways in which a colonial infrastructure becomes an armature for the production of a completely different urban culture. So all of these were basically an invitation to think about not only a kind of like dualistic understanding of the city above and the city below, but also like what kind of new languages are possible to make sense of this condition that exists in a way that the vocabularies that are made available to us are not adequate to account for. So it started with me really trying to look, like figuring out how many hairdressers, where are they, how do they work, to understanding that there's something about the system of representation that doesn't allow me to grasp what is actually going on. And so this question of like pinning things down and being mobile is very interesting, because when I think with Abdul Malik Simone, for instance, he talks about the ways in which being mobile is a really important strategy for survival. That's to be located in places, actually to be enclosed, to be pinned down, whereas to be hypermobile, to be in circulation, is also a way of accumulating knowledge, of constructing an assemblage of relationships. And this is what he calls ensemble work. So I also really appreciated your analogy of the forest as opposed to the tree, because it speaks to I think it speaks to like just like the vast knowledges that are possible and that could become available for future generations. But I'm also thinking about Anna Tsing's work about, you know, the mushroom at the end of the world, and how there are different kinds of possibilities within conditions of ruination, right? So thinking about mushrooms and these like new networks that are forming in spaces that certain registers don't allow us to see or find value in. So it's about finding value and seeing value in the spaces of dereliction, in the spaces of abandonment, in understanding the value of porosity, in understanding the value of mobility, and maybe thinking about or rethinking the possibility of inhabitation in different ways. So I think that the Albordo example of the house of the flying beds is a way of reimagining inhabitation and a much more sort of generous shared space. And I'm wondering if it's possible to have a different kind of epistemology around urbanism, not only in the global south, but, you know, that because we know that they're also like fragments. They're fragments of Africa, fragments of Asia in cities in Europe and America. So how does that kind of Southern sensibility begin to inform the way we even imagine cities like New York or London or, I don't know, Wilmington, Delaware? So I think that the forest analogy is wonderful for accounting for the multiplicity of ways of being in the city.
Thank you very much. I really look forward to knowing more of your works in the future. Thank you very much. And we can give the floor to the audience here who want to have some comments or raise questions to Dr. Matsipa.
I think there's Joao Navarrete and Elias Constantopoulos that want to speak. So Joao, you have the word.
Thanks. Thanks for the pronunciation of my last name. Was the most perfect pronunciation I've heard. Thank you for the lecture. Matsipa was just wonderful. And I think when I heard you speak, it really remembered me a really strong experience I had in my life, which was in the beginning of my undergraduate studies in the university I studied here in Brazil. We had this very interesting partnership program with African universities. And we had the opportunity to work with exchange students from Ethiopia, South Africa, and Angola. And I think one of the most striking things that I had here in Brazil in contact with African students is how when we spoke with Europeans or North Americans, students from Africa in general, they had the closest worldview from us, the way they see the world. It was quite remarkable. It was extremely different from Europeans or North Americans. The problems that they see in their countries, the dilemmas they see for the future was very similar to the ones we see in South America. And when you see how citing Achilles Mbembe, how we frame our view regarding our own continents as negative, which is a consequence of colonization, I think this can be something that can be twisted, as you showed in these works, that can be twisted and it can be shown actually in a very positive manner as a civilizatory program for these regions. Here in Brazil, for instance, we have Caetano Veloso, which is a very famous songwriter, and he writes books also. But he has this very interesting idea that when Latin America solves its problem, it is actually solving the Western civilization as a whole. Because Europeans and North Americans, they have a problem. They think that the Western civilization is Europe and North America. You know, they forget that everything was built because of colonization. So Western civilization is not the North, is everything. And if you want to solve the problems of Western civilization, you have to solve the South, actually. That's the solving the problem, you know. So we have not yet seen what a full developed Western civilization looks like, because South America and Africa are still in the position they are. That's not conceptually possible. And also Castro Gomes, which is a brilliant Colombian intellectual, he has a very interesting text in which he says that Europeans also interpret in a very limited way the concept of modernization, in which they think that modernization is the European modernization and the process of European modernization. They forget, for instance, that Latin America, since the 19th century, already had modernization, and we are going through modernization. But what is modernization for a colonial state? Is rules of custom. It's actually violence against traditions that were here for decades and centuries. And this is how modernization is understood through a colonial process. So we are still up to the task of building a positive modernization for another context. We are up to the task of building another republicanism for a context outside Europe. And that's I think all the works you show and all of this show a very how can I say, a very fructiferous path for the global South. I think the future somehow is on our hands, and we have a lot to do. And this also, Wilfred has said something in the last weekend, which I think it's the cornerstone for in all the stuff for architectural thinking, which is every building is like a fragment of a civilizatory speech. So, for example, the building you showed from aboard, that shows a different view of what another civilization might look like already now in the present. And I think that is our tasks as architects and urban planners today. I think that is the actual political dimension of architecture nowadays.
Thank you, Joao. I don't know if Fo wants to answer, or we have the intervention of Elias first.
As you like.
Go ahead, Elias.
Thank you, Dr. Matsipa, for this very interesting lecture, which I think is pertinent to a West growing old and having to live with the remnants and contradictions of applied modernism to the degree that it did. So I think it's very relevant to all of us. I think it's interesting that also from the projects that you showed us, more than in architectural projects, it is in works like Akurakuda, in graphic novellas, where you have such a critique, even in graphic novels of the West. And I think there is a reason for that. For example, I don't know if you know, there is The Fever of Yurbikand by Schuit and Peters. There is the Nikopol trilogy by Enki Bilal, where they show dystopian visions of the Western metropolis. And I think it's very interesting if one looks at this next to Akurakuda. For this reason, I think it's interesting to think about what you talked about Aisha Balde, where the real, the physical is entangled with the imaginary. And I would like to ask you how exactly, because from one slide we saw, we couldn't really tell, it was very atmospheric, how that actually happens. They seem to be indistinguishable. Does the imaginary work in a sort of subversive way regarding the real? How are they mixed? Because in graphic novellas, they do that very well. They're like versions of Blade Runner, for example.
Thank you, Elias. Would you like to comment on this remarks?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you, Joao and Elias, for your comments. I think, and please do share your references with me, because you are citing authors that I'm not familiar with, but that I clearly should be in conversation with. I think that your provocations, João, around, usually people who have a teleological understanding of modernity would simply understand, places like Africa, Latin America, Asia as sites of an incomplete modernity. But your provocation that in fact all modernity is incomplete, and that this idea that that to arrive, if there is such a thing as arrival, assuming that there is such a thing as arrival, that one can only get there by really grappling seriously with the challenges or the contradictions that are produced through the same process of modernization. And this is really acute for me, just having come back from Lubumbashi, which is basically a site of extraction and continues to be a site of extraction since at least the 19th century. And to understand this too as part of the process of modernity, right? The devastation of livelihoods, the destruction of ecosystems, people breathing in toxic air. So this is super important in terms of thinking about it as a political project as well as a spatial project. And then Elias, I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's an interesting provocation, like this distinction between the imaginary and the real. And I remember, when we were in Lagos doing workshops for African mobilities, and we were speaking about different genres of writing. And this probably relates both to Latin America and Africa, where in Latin America, what is understood as magical realism in Africa is simply understood as everyday life. So what somehow seems otherworldly, unbelievable, unrealistic is actually understood as something that is happening in real life. So I don't know how this distinction works in this context, but it's something that I'd like to think about, because there's also a lot of anthropologists who talk about rumor as a form of knowledge, and how so much of what we know and navigate, used to navigate the city, is based on sort of like unspecific, unverified data that then becomes the fuel. So this clear distinction between what is real and what is not real, what is fact, what is fiction, what is rumor, that those distinctions start to blur in certain kinds of ways. And I think that what Aisha Balde's work begins to do is to understand that there is the fact of Cape Verde, but then there's also the fact that as somebody who is an immigrant or a refugee, your understanding of territory becomes very different, and what seems uninhabitable, unworkable, in kind of stable normative ways has to become habitable, or you have to find ways of residing in spaces that are deemed uninhabitable. And this is probably about the limits, the limit case of what it means to be human in the world, right? Like what are the spatial conditions that people can actually occupy that were actually not deemed habitable? So this idea is represented in her remapping of the Atlantic Ocean, remapping the currents of the ocean, remapping the rate of wind when it can actually be navigated and when it's unnavigable. But it also refers to what some scholars would describe as the undercommons or the fugitive, right? So in Johannesburg on the edges, and also in Lubumbashi, you have an entire society, an entire world that exists in the subterranean space, where you have artisanal miners who are doing all kinds of things and creating different kinds of landscapes. So I don't know. In short, I don't know how to make this distinction, because in some ways, I have to do more thinking about the role of the imaginary in sort of making spaces that are not designed for habitation livable.
Maybe one doesn't have to make the distinction. The reason why I asked it is because the graphic novellas are so convincing through their narrative about what they're putting forward. And in all of these, whereas maybe it was just the image we just saw on our screen, whereas in the case of Aisha Balde, one would like to know more whether this kind of mapping is something that might be imagined and something that will become applicable, or it stays on that level, whether it constructs its own narrative. And on a level of representation and mapping, and that's it. So I wasn't expecting an answer
Ah.
how to distinguish them, but how it works within an architectural framework, whereas in a graphic novel it comes complete as a narrative.
Ah, I see. I think that in her case it was actually about this idea of territory, and finding a territory that is outside of the state, that can accommodate subjectivities that are seen as not belonging or that are unmoored. So also making a distinction between property and territory, or property and site, are distinctions or tensions that she's trying to tease out in her work. So in other representations or manifestations of the exploration, it's a kind of floating way station that inhabits a space beyond the national territory.
Thank you. Wilfred Wang would like to say something, and then Silvia Arango. Wilfred.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you for, I think it was a very poignant presentation, actually, as a reminder to all of us in the global north, especially in the European fortress. You are holding up a mirror, and what we see is a certain degree of hypocrisy. Certainly, I can speak for European points of view. In Germany, all Germans think they have a right to move around from wherever they want. And if they want to move from Germany to another country, of course, they can settle in Africa and South America, in the United States and elsewhere, right? So, but if somebody wants to come the other way, no way. So the issue of mobility, I think, is a major topic still in Germany. When the previous Chancellor, Angela Merkel, was celebrated for her oh so humane opening of the doors to all the refugees in 2015, which of course was part of the failure of European governments anyway. But the issue is mobility is a measure of equality, right? And so who can move where and why not? And the internal mobility within Africa, I think, is an important topic. It has, of course, registered amongst certain people in the global north, but not with everybody. And just as a micro phenomenon, within Germany, there's a lot of mobility. There is a lot of movement from the cities to the suburbs, actual physical relocation. And if one traces the value system that is behind that, of course, people are trying to live cheaper. They're trying to develop their own lifestyles. They want to have their individual way of living, right? So everywhere around the world, it's the same force behind mobility, that is to establish one's own life, and in as dignified and maybe as beautiful a manner as possible. So if we talk about mobility, we need to talk about the realization of lifestyles, or the realization of existence altogether. And if that is not possible, what are the options to hand? And so I think that the fact that a simple, basic self-assertion of existence in a dignified circumstance is an issue that, of course, we as architects and urban designers and planners have to deal with in any case. And I agree with João. I think if we can bring some form of order, not order, but equality, I think is the right word, to the way that the environment is being structured, I think that that's one of the first tasks that various governments around the world need to address. But before we talk about quality, we need to talk about equality. And so with equality, the notion is to recognize that every human has the right to a dignified life in safe and stable condition. And safe and stable conditions is the opposite to mobility. I think people don't necessarily want to be mobile if they don't have to be, but if they don't have an option, that's what they do. They go and uproot themselves and try to move to another place that promises a greater degree of stability. Final comment, in Germany, and I think that's true for European condition as a whole, maybe also the United States, we have a desire for a stable state that no longer is going to be there in the next few years. We have an erosion of the stable state, and we're noticing it with the increase in, well, from inflation to energy costs. And I don't believe the Europeans have as yet understood what is happening as a result of the various crises that have unfolded. And the invasion of Russia into Ukraine is only a kind of another emergency issue, but the underlying problem has always been that European and North American lifestyles have existed at the expense of the rest of the world. And the climate crisis is just a kind of a proof of the fact. So all of these things are unfortunately related, but everything that the European Union and the European fortress is trying to do is to preserve the stable state that no longer exists or no longer can exist like this, but people haven't realized it yet.
I think that there's a very interesting way in which, the apocalyptic narratives of science fiction novellas are absolutely right. It is the end of the world. And I think in a sense, it's the end of the world as we know it. And, Toni Morrison would argue that this is not necessarily a cause for mourning, that maybe this world should end so that a new kind of order can emerge. And to go back to what Joao was saying, that to find a new beginning, one needs to look south. Because we've kind of reached the limit or the limit case of where this particular logic will lead us, and one needs to rethink it. I'm not sure whether it's simply a matter of rethinking, or if something catastrophic or cataclysmic has to happen before there's a radical shift in those relations.
We now have Silvia Arango.
Hello, I just don't like the term Global South to describe the otherness to the Western civilization, or to the point of view of seeing the rest of the world. But anyway, I do think in many similarities between certain parts of Africa and certain parts of Latin America. And I kept wondering through your presentation why you chose a project in Ecuador and why you didn't show an example that could be equivalent in Africa, in some place of Africa. Is there other architecture similar or comparable to that one in Ecuador you showed?
Thank you, Sylvia, for your comments. I agree. I think that the language and the words we use to describe ourselves is something that needs to be constantly under review. I know that Rahul Malhotra refers to the locations that we inhabit as the majority world, as opposed to global south. So I understand that that the names are changing all the time. In terms of like using our border as a reference point, it's one of many, and one could probably have invoked other examples. It's just the one that first came to mind. I wasn't making any grand geographical distinction between, it was more about understanding a particular approach about how to inhabit a space from an architectural point of view. But I think that when I think about my own research in downtown Johannesburg, the ways in which people make do and make space and reconfigure space, that there's multiple examples of how that is done, except that it hasn't been codified in the way that it's codified in the Ecuadorian example. So I think it's more around the professionalization of that practice in that case study, and the fact that it's a very experimental and collective studio. And I would have to look a lot harder to find examples of that that I'm familiar with in the South African context. So I accept the challenge. And I'll look harder, I guess, but I think it's a useful example, and it's an imaginative example. And it's also interesting. It would be interesting to know to what extent this particular innovation complies with code. Like, do Ecuadorian building codes allow for the suspension of sleeping quarters over the living space, or does it actually push against a set of established bylaws, rules, safety codes, and how buildings are constructed? Because I think in some ways, these moments of invention and reimagination are a challenging of what we assume to be a stable set of coordinates for how architecture is produced. So that I think that was what was valuable for me in looking at that and the kinds of questions that it poses. Or if this is actually, it can't be clandestine because it's so widely published, but it seems like a clandestine practice somehow.
Thank you. There's Wilfred that wants to say something else. Then I would just say small words, and I would leave to Xiangning to close this first part so we can have a short break. Wilfred.
The issue of code is interesting because why should we apply the notion of code as a regulatory discipline if others don't comply with codes? That's to say, maybe you should review this idea of code, because if you come to Germany, you think every German citizen is, very compliant with codes. Not at all. If you look at the building, if you look at the history of construction in various places, you see so many illegal constructions that have accumulated from the large to the small, that you would really be absolutely surprised, or maybe not. That's to say, we have this also maybe a culturally conditioned idea that, the global north is more compliant with codes. We have more codes, but that doesn't mean we comply with them.
Thank you, Wilfred. Thank you, everybody that gave their input today. My closing goes with something that Wilfred just said in his previous intervention. He says, before we have quality, we need equality. And for me, not only that assessment is important, for me it's important because it brings us back to quality. That is the main idea of this conference. And then Li Xiangning, will you close? And we'll go to a break.
Okay. I think Dr. Matsipa's keynote speech today is does generate a very hot discussion and huge interest around the topics that she brought to us. I think when we Luis, you said that before quality we should consider equality. But I think regarding the quality of architecture, the social quality is also one of the aspects that could be considered as a part of a quality. So equality and fairness and everything, how to think of it is difficult and complicated, but everybody should think of it, and how to distinguish yourself and the other, and also how to feel the feelings of the other, and how to understand the kind of let's say fluidity, and also as Dr. Matsipa put it, the uninhabitable and unseen or invisible. So I think it's really a good topic for all of us. Maybe it deserves a lot of discussion, and we could continue this for another hour. But I really appreciate her presentation, and we spent a wonderful 1 hour and a half. It passed so quickly, said that we didn't even notice already. It's the breaking time. But I think we would like to continue at the round table afterwards, to maybe some of you will come back to the topics that we just covered and barely covered. So I think maybe it's the time for a little drink, and come back to here in 10 minutes.
Yes.
Luis?
Yes,
Thank-
in 10
yes.
minutes, we'll
Thank
be
you.
all back.
Thank you again, Matsipa, for a wonderful presentation and all the discussions brought by the members here. Thank you very much. See you in 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Lee and Louise.
Xiangning, if you like, you could restart the second part.
Luis is going to introduce the two presenters of the paper.
Sorry, I was having a coffee. Yes, we are having two presentations now that I think are quite interesting. I read the abstracts, well, a bit more than long abstracts. And we will go back to architecture more as the built condition of it. The first presenter will be Marta Peixoto from the Federal University of Porto Alegre in Brazil. She's a long-standing and well-recognized researcher in her area, mainly of interior architecture, interior design. And we will be hearing today about two very singular houses and the way of how quality and the intangible of quality is important in this case, mainly the quality for the persons that live in those houses. So Marta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you for all the organizers of this conference. I will share my screen. Wait a minute. Can you see now or not?
No. Yes.
Okay. So let's start it. The Butanta house is the residence Paulo Mendes da Rocha built for his family. It is a two-story volume with the main activities all on the upper floor, leaving only the laundry, the car shelter, and an open area for children on the ground. The layout consists of three parts: a family room at the entrance, an internal sector of bedrooms, bathrooms, closets, and a kitchen, and a living room at the end. Since circulation between the two rooms next to the facades happens freely across all rooms, not just through the corridor, there is not enough visual privacy. Furthermore, as there is no lining and no internal partition reaches the slab, there is no sound insulation either. Pericampos' house was designed for a client by Rodrigo Lefebvre. It is a single volume, an inverted catenary shaped dome. In the front yard, a volume with service rooms stands out from the main body. Inside, a longitudinal circulation organizes the successive spaces. The first room is a hall, and on the right side is the kitchen. Following the hall is the dining room. Behind the kitchen are bedrooms, bathrooms, and a small staircase that leads to an office and an apparent water tank above them. The living room opens onto the back garden at the end of the course. The double height of the hall and the living room make these places more significant. On the contrary, in the bedrooms, their tiny areas lose space due to the curve of the vault. Both architects designed two houses where spaces for socialization are much more important than the individual ones. Mendes da Rocha had a long career of international prestige. His house stands out for the unusual residential use of exposed reinforced concrete, the boldness of the structure, and the radical layout. Even though he died under the age of 50, Lefebvre has a significant production nationally recognized, mainly in academia. He worked with colleagues equally interested in construction techniques contrary to the supposed Brazilian industrial development, using ordinary processes and cheap materials, such as this vaulted house, as a solution for affordable housing. Mendes da Rocha's youngest daughter occupied one of the toilets at the Butantan house and lived there for months when she was still a child. Today, one of his sons lives in the house, and his daughter, the architect's granddaughter, did the same as her aunt did decades before. Her teenage stepsister, in turn, moved to the laundry. The daughter of Pericampus House's current occupants used the maid's room, isolated and much bigger than hers, as a bedroom. Subverting the work of renowned architects did not stop these girls. So was it just an ephemeral rebellion, or is there something else that requires our attention? Well, building have three conditions: commodity, firmness, and delight. Geoffrey Scott said that a theory of architecture is started from this phrase by Henry Wotton, adapting Vitruvius. However, Scott observed that architecture criticism had been confused in this quotation mark arbitrary intention of converting three distinct purposes mixed in a single method despite their disparity. About firmness, he declared that architecture was judged by the exactness and sincerity with which it expressed constructive facts and laws. The desire for delight was a purely aesthetic impulse, distinct from all the others that architecture had to satisfy simultaneously. By that, architecture would become art with its standard and authority. On the other hand, commodity arose to satisfy an external need, and buildings would be valued for the success with which they enable the practical ends for which they were designed. Firmness was a logical standard, while delight was an independent one. Commodity has brought social, political, and religious factors into the equation, dealing with standards far removed from logic. When leaving their original bedrooms, the young residents of these two houses antagonized the author's idea especially regarding, quotation mark, commodity. Paulo Mendes da Rocha's daughter and granddaughter settle in a toilet in search of greater privacy and more identification in a place to call their own. For the same reasons, his son's stepdaughter preferred a certain amount of discomfort to the excessive exposure on the main floor. The issue in Pericampo's house seems to have been the lack of livability. The only daughter's move happened due to a simple fact, the lack of space. Both residences' layouts were not flexible enough to allow another solution. Architecture, while having a purpose, is also about rethinking the way of doing things, like all creative work. So doses of rebellion and nonconformity to pre-established standards are desirable or respected. Probably Paulo Mendes da Rocha and Rodrigo Lefebvre designed these residences according to a world model they imagined to be the best, where the evaluation of the collective over the individual should be an indisputable reality. Both projects had an evident ideological commitment in line with the spirit of engagement of the 1950s and 1960s and shared among architects and their small clientele at that time. It is not by chance that the insurgency reported here was carried out by younger members, probably disconnected from any intellectual pretensions at the time. Maybe both authors went too far in these two cases, one for being the owner and the other for sharing the same anti-bourgeois ideal with a very close client. Furthermore, if that brings any consolation, they enjoy the company of people of the caliber of Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe in the group of avant-garde architects who provoked the users' discontent. After all, more than being entitled to innovation and defiance, they are part of the nature of their activity. Designers have the freedom to do whatever and however they want, and users have the right to approve or not their proposals. Criticism has another role. Most critics praise these two houses, even if in different ways and degrees, focusing on structural and formal solutions, quotation mark, firmness and delight, according to Scott. They treat commodity-related problems more superficially, toned down as if they were fun tales, and minimize the lack of privacy and space by framing the architect's project in the spirit of its time. This quotation mark rebellion is interpreted as a sly complaint from spoiled elite girls who cannot understand an avant-garde socialization proposal. Even though the architects were indeed in line with their zeitgeist and the bedrooms in both houses allowed the strict performance of their function, it seems necessary for the criticism to be less passionate. Passion restricts vision and prevents criticism from researching aspects that show the complexity of these authors. For example, lack of privacy or the reduction of private space to a minimum can be interpreted is a form of control, just like fixed furniture can be understood as a restriction on freedom. Both characteristics, as they are contrary to the declared intention of this architect, are not even observed most of the time, which is inappropriate. Being in favor or of or against something is not a problem, and perhaps there is not even unbiased criticism. Nevertheless, analyzing intentionally or not an incomplete or deformed version of a work of architecture instead of the whole is not recommended, since it potentially produces fragmentary assessment. While disregarding this house's privacy and livability issues, critics do not praise their authors as they may seem at first. Instead, they lead to a flattening of their work. Facing the client's dissatisfaction and the reasons that led to it can bring other interpretations about authors and their works by providing broader analysis. Finally, the more the view of the work of architecture and its circumstances enlarged, the more knowledge about architecture expands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marta. Since we have now 10 minutes, I will give the floor to Li Xiangning and whomever wants to make a short question, and then we'll have later, after the second presentation, larger time for discussion. Xiangning.
Okay. Dear Marta, I really appreciate this, the research about the conflicts, let's say, critics versus dwellers. Quality is always something that we are thinking about, not only the material quality, but also you raised the question, quality to whom? As I understand that, it's very difficult to these days to know what the designers are thinking. Do you know any did you, I just wonder, did you do any research about how the house of Paulo Mendes da Rocha was used when the family was living there? I know, just a quick question.
Yes, I try to show this in this presentation because indeed this house, Butanta House, is a pair of two houses. One house for Paulo Mendes da Rocha's family, and the other house for the sister of Paulo Mendes da Rocha, And so since the beginning, the house of Paulo Mendes da Rocha, they lived there in the way he designed the house, but he had another child was born a few years after they moved to the house, and this girl went to live some months in the bathroom, one of the toilets of the house. So in a way to find a privacy, and he talked about this, and he told about this story with a bit of pleasure, in a way, of the way the young girl is a kind of subversive against or about his father, her father. So they live there in the way the house is, and now his son, Paulo Mendes da Rocha's son, one of his sons, is living there, and they live in the house in the way the house was designed. But
Well,
in the house of his sister, since the beginning, they built or they made a kind of ceiling in the bedrooms to solve part of this problem. The problem that the house has no sound insulation, visual isolation, and so on.
well, I visit I visit this house a couple years ago. It's just by accident that by incident that I when I visit the city, I found it that this from the website that this house was on sale on the market. So I couldn't go to see that. So I called the dealer that I pretended to be a positive
client.
possible buyer from China. So the dealer
A
sold me
billionaire from China.
actually everything. So, but I'm happy that I visit the house. But I feel the kind of a corridor thing that facing the street. Maybe you would think the house. I think the dweller will feel maybe lack of kind of lacking of privacy. But also the question I would have is you are distinguishing the critics or designers versus the dwellers. But what about different dwellers? Maybe the feeling about privacy might differ between different users. So is this something that could be compared with the differences between designers or critics and dwellers? What do you think?
Oh, I understand your question, but in a way I agree with you that if you change dwellers, you change the relation from dwellers and the architect. But what I want to point out is the fact that I think that sometimes when some work has a kind of quality, for me, it's not a problem. But there is some kind of discussion about some issue. We have to deal with this issue, or and not avoid to talk about. And I think that this quality of the house is a quality of this house. I'm not saying that is a bad quality, but that is a quality. That's my opinion about this. I don't know if I answer you, but
Okay, thank you. There are two. I see two people wants to say something. Matsipa.
Thank you very much, Marta, for your presentation. I was fascinated by this question of privacy, and I wondered if you had any opinions about it, because it seems to me that it's not just about visual privacy, it's also acoustic as well.
yes.
Through the design of the house. And what kind of ideological work does the kind of disappearance of privacy entail? Like what kind of sociality is implied by this idea that there are no more boundaries, whether visual or acoustic?
Well, I think I don't know at all, but Paulo Mendes da Rocha and Rui Otaki at that moment, and this architect Rodrigo Lefebvre, they are very committed with the idea of socialization and to share the house and the life of the occupants of the house. So in the case of Paulo Mendes da Rocha, in a way, he imposed this idea to his family, of course, and they live there and they grew up there in this house, and they had another child, so they had sex in this house. So they lived with this concept that, in a way, is against some pre-established or established, or another, not established or pre-established, but another way of living that was more usual in Brazil at that time. But I like this kind of, I call this rebellion, because for me it's something to think about, the way that sometimes architects put the ideal or the a concept in front of some, I don't know if it is necessities or I don't know, but I don't know the word in English in this moment, but it's the house, of course, is very conceptual. And the second one, the Rodrigo Lefebvre's house, he built for an client that left Brazil soon after the house was built, because he escaped from the ditadura, the revolution we had here.
Military dictatorship.
Yes, military dictatorship. So they don't live in the house, the client. And now there is a teacher of USP, the University of São Paulo, an architect that lives there, and his daughter moved to the servant's room because the servant's room is bigger than her own bedroom, not because of ideal of social equilibrium, but because the idea of the architect about rooms or bedrooms at that time was very, very, very small bedrooms, very, very small units to private life. It's an idea, very clear. They want to force, in a way, the life in spaces, social spaces in the house.
Mhm. Okay, so John Navarrete, you want to raise your question?
Yes. The question you asked, this is so far as I know, but I can be wrong. But I know that when you went to Casa Butantan for a visit as a potential buyer, who was selling the house was
the sister. Yeah.
It was
Yes.
a sister.
I think.
Yes.
Yes, and I've heard that from people that know her that she had some difficulties living there. She had a great affection with the house and so on, but she had. I know that some houses of Paulo Mendes da Rocha, this is what I'm going to say is not applicable to all houses that he has done, but I know that some of them are kind of difficult to live in. For instance, I know that Casa Milan was extremely difficult to live in, and the clients almost never used it. Some of them have this question, but for me it's also really interesting because the master of Paulo Mendes da Rocha is Vila Nova Artigas, who is like the main figure of brutalism in São Paulo. And 5 years later, after this house was built, Casa Butantan, Artigas built Casa Bercó, which is he takes a very different stance on brutalism, and he makes it way more accessible. In some ways, he's talking with pop culture, and he's talking with some things which are, let's say, like this, more accessible and more broad in terms of culture, and not that strict purist brutalism. And probably this happened due to his own observations of how hard these houses were and kind of stuff.
Okay, I think we have more time to talk about for Marta's presentation. And now we also give the floor to Mara Bitru, that will present her paper architecture's visions and intangible materials. She is finishing her PhD at the National Technical University of Athens. And her paper is very interesting because it joins Marta Peixoto paper in asking who is able to do the judging. So Mara, you please share your screen and give us your paper.
First of all, I'm very happy for being given the opportunity to participate to this conference. This piece of work is focused on the implication of the architectural qualities perception, which involves the profound relationship that it is established between the architectural object and the individual who holds for the object itself symbolic and emotional connotation, and the vision that the architect has for his architectural work during his intellectual conception and design. According to the genealogy of the word quality, it derives from the Latin word qualis, which means character, disposition, where one could correlate quality with intangible materials and with the perception of the reading at all levels in every architectural creation. 2 case studies of building have been selected in order to approach the intangible elements that affect and enhance architectural quality, the vision of the architect, and the sensory perception of the user. Having as a 3D approach of the architectural form of work of Takis Zenetos, a Greek architect, as a form that is not a stable form of the building, but shows that things change, and something that introduces the concept of time and architectural quality as something that is not finished. The case study Electronic Urbanism, which is a research project of habitation, have been selected for the purpose of examining the relationship between the space and the quality as far as the concept of time is concerned. If we consider the space is not just the background which cubes matters, but on the contrary, it provokes them, then time is a dynamic factor in the design process where it stops being ultimate and creates a 4-dimensional model whose 4 coordinates coexist without distinction. A subject does not perceive time only as strong experience, as according to Henri Bergson, there is a principle where time and space, namely the duration and the extent, coexist on endosmosis, the phenomenon of endosmosis, where specifically Zenetos design, without having been assigned by a client, an above ground city with detailed plans like the city will be indeed real and workable. At a time where modernity was dominating, Zenetos reconsidered fundamentally the views for urban net towards a new planetic vision. Takis Zenetos presents for the very first time his project Electronic Urbanism in the Contemporary Residence Organization exhibition in Athens, 1962. His design proposal introduced an organizational system of a suspended city. This is a system of wire suspended slabs where all city's activity can take place and people can be interconnected through communication technology. Zenetos refer to the global and the continuous urban net that it covers it.
Excuse me, Mara. Can you share your screen or enlarge the image? And
Slides are not moving.
And yeah, you need to operate your images.
You're not going through the slides.
You need to go to the bottom of the rectangle, and there is yeah.
Oh yeah, it goes.
Can you help me?
Yes.
Still not, it's still not the main because we're looking at both images.
Oh, okay. You can see the PowerPoint.
No, we are seeing your view.
Oh, okay.
Excuse me, I will speak in Greek in order to help her.
Yes.
Μα
Ναι.
πήγαινε πίσω, η Αριάδνη Βοζάνη με πήγαινε πίσω, εκεί που ήσουν πριν. Κάτι κάνεις τώρα, δηλαδή βγες από αυτό το mode που είσαι. Κλείστο και ξανά άνοιξέ το άμα θέλεις.
Ναι, ευχαριστώ.
Ωραία, εδώ πήγαινε κάτω-κάτω. Στο κάτω μέρος της σελίδας θα δεις, έχει μια οθονίτσα. Πάτησέ την για να ανοίξει.
Ναι.
Το πάτησα και την προηγούμενη φορά.
Τώρα δεν φαίνεται. Για να δούμε.
Δεν ανοίγει ούτε σε μένα το slideshow, από ό,τι βλέπω.
Α, ούτε σε σένα.
Ναι. Give me a second.
Να, τώρα φάνηκε αυτό. Ποια πήγαινε στην οθόνη, κάτω-κάτω. Υπάρχει δεξιά ένα πράγμα σαν οθόνη. Αυτό, για πάτα το.
Ένα λεπτό μάλλον να ξαναρμίξω το αρχείο.
Εδώ πρέπει, εδώ. Αυτό πρέπει να πατήσεις, που σου έκανα κόκκινο.
Ναι, αυτό το πάτησα και πριν. Το πατάω, αλλά δεν ανοίγει σε slideshow. Δεν ξέρω γιατί.
Okay.
Δεν ξέρω. Οπότε, απλώς βλέπετε να ακούνε απλώς την μπάρα.
Τουλάχιστον, ναι.
Ωραία. Ευχαριστώ πολύ για την βοήθεια.
Τίποτα. Και έχει δίκιο που σου λέει να μην κουνιέσαι, γιατί η φωνή σου χάνεται και επανέρχεται. Δηλαδή, να ακούμε λίγο συμποπτώμενη.
Οκ. Ωραία. Οπότε τώρα βλέπετε κανονικά την οθόνη, απλώς το αλλάζω εγώ το slides χειροκίνητα. Είναι
Ναι.
OK.
Βλέπουμε όμως και κατάλαβες όλη σου την οθόνη. Δηλαδή δεν φαίνεται μόνο το slide, φαίνονται και τα αριστερά slide και τα λοιπά.
Ναι. Απλώς θα βάλω αυτό εδώ, για να μην κρύβει. Δυστυχώς πατάω την οθόνη, αλλά δεν κάνει κάτι. Δεν ξέρω γιατί. Το τσέκαρα δηλαδή πριν.
Για κλείσε το slideshow που έχεις πάνω δεξιά, πάνω αριστερά. Έχεις ένα κόκκινο παράθυρο που λέει slideshow. Όχι πιο χαμηλά. Ναι, για κλείσε το. Για προσπάθησε τώρα να ανοίξεις το παραθυράκι.
Όχι, δεν κάνει κάτι.
Όχι, εντάξει.
Θα το κάνω χειροκίνητα αν είναι. Ευχαριστώ για την βοήθεια και πάλι.
I'm sorry, it was not possible.
Yeah. One could agree that for Zenetos, if the architectural work has quality, that means that we will have to reconsider the issue of space on a new footing. For Zenetos, space is not just a form of externality, a kind of screen, but space itself should be based in things, in the relationship among the things and among durations. Zenetos uses the concept of time as a designing material and performs projections in time, namely projecting space into time and not time into space through morphological representation. For Zenetos, time is a designing material that is not understood as the provision of eternity, but as an openness to the unexpected. The architectural quality concept is being depicted in the retrojection of the doable and Zenetos design through an illustration of the future. The architectural quality of this unrealized project of electronic urbanism is being depicted, enabling the approach of a proposed real project with detailed architectural plans. Zenetos, with theoretical and design approach, of this case study points out that the experience provides only mixtures of time and space, as every experience we create for time is a representation that is being penetrated by space. In this representation, these two elements, time and space, are not distinguished with regard to the presences. Thus, the space concept in relation with the time concept are not two autonomous qualitative categories. In the qualitative categories of an architectural project, which are related to the element of space and the element of time, we count a mixture where time brings his internal and constant points, while space introduces as the shape of his exogenous distinction of his homogeneous and inconsonant sections. Thus, in addition to the architectural morphological design of the suspending city, he processed the development of services and disagrees with the coexist of industry and housing. The most important parameter in Zeneto's idea of electronic urbanism was the emphasis he added to the electronics. In particular, Zenetos considering that urban planning and technologies follow parallel paths in the revolution. Through the design of the transitional stages, he moves from the imaginary time of ideas and abstract time, which were unable to identify and represent, to the transition of a time with transformations, to a time almost measurable and describable. In this project, between 2A, the city today, and the future city, there is the stage between, foreseeing 10 to 15 years ahead, the orientation to this urban planning, suggesting at the same time detailed transitional stages as a transformation and not as a change only, that could set a future utopic situation in juxtaposition to the current one. From the idea of a net scale without limits, where the scale is a liquid that tends to cover the whole Earth, to the scale without limits, referring to time, where the limits we set in the past were exceeded and the limits we set today are movable. The idea of limitless architecture tends to identify moving from the concept of space to the concept of time's change and ultimate to the change of architectural quality. Zenetos designs an open group of elements that are functional adapt according to the changing wishes of the user through the reprogramming capabilities that shape and redefine the quality of the architectural space. On the other hand, the designed transitional stages of electronic urbanism, where there show various times, various transitions, they operate as continuous phases of evolution that penetrate into each other, as if they were capabilities designed in advance, and as if the architect's will was not limited only to carry out architectural work. I've been lost. Here are some plans. This is the horizontal plan of the idea of Zenetos, that we can see that there are so many details that he has designed, and under which you can see the section of this. And this is a 3D model. Thinking architectural quality as something which can be understood as a specific relation with a place, the concept of architectural quality is approached in Brion Cemetery, designed by Carlos Scarpa. The example of Brion Cemetery has been chosen because the visitor is invited in a game which is formed between his perception of the space and his sensory one. Scarpa design in Brion Cemetery focus on the concept of assembling the forms and the designs their details as a way of separating these forms, and at the same time as the way of their conversation. From the rails detail on the door of the cemetery entrance to the door inside the water that he has designed, each form of geometry space is not only enriched with patterns that enclose its outline, but also its relation with light. On Earth, Scarpa, embryonic top, designs roots forms linking different experience with the ground. The sensor perception is not related to an intake of a kind of architectural illustration. Through the ideas and the senses succeed each other as eyes, light, body, and sound give us the information of space quality through the perceptual capability of the user. The design of the landscape of Brion Cemetery, the use of light in the small church, the glass door in the garden, sign the fact that the sensory perception of the space acts as a special factor which attaches quality. Scarpa designed a garden elevated to a level of the countryside within which there are a series of individual buildings which have the characters of episode in which there are reference to the death are involved in themes that prize life. The area of the cemetery is enclosed by a wall within which are the buildings. From the bare side of the Brion couple under the arch structure, two smooth plant areas begin. Scarpa's drafts regarding cemetery represent a human presence looking through the eyes of the garden, as Scarpa characterized the two intersecting circles. According to Foscari, in a paper of him in 1984, Scarpa's drawing do not serve the purpose of Cartesian figurative geometry, but are description of the course from the theoretically possible to the real. Space for Carlos Scarpa is composed through the physical entities, by the sense of gravity, by the presence of a wall or a passage, by the thickness of material. As a conclusion, this piece of work sets out to locate that the physiognomy of the architectural quality beyond measurable criteria based on the spatial relationship between the building and the architect through his design vision and the perception of by the user. Therefore, there is a concept of quality which at any moment can be associated by a state of external world and a real space where phenomena appear and disappear. Thus, from the comparison of these two concepts, the concept of quality and the concept of space, the symbolic representation of quality drawn from space is born. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mara. I pass the word to Li Xiangning for his comments.
Well, Mara, I'm not quite sure, I understand completely what you are trying to say, but I'll try to say some observations. First, I think you talked about time and space, and there are two aspects. One, maybe the architect, when an architect design or a planner doing a city, so there's something that he or she conceived at the very beginning, and then later when the city changes and grows when time pass by. Also, there's some architects are designing things to a specific clients and to his requires, and then others will just design and the perception the users of the spaces and not just passive reception of the spaces that the architects tends to convey, but the users are using different senses to feel, and his own active, reading and understanding and perception of the space. It adds to different layers of the meanings of the spaces. I'm not sure whether this is true, or is this the points that you want to say to us?
Exactly. The idea is that I would like to have two different examples. One which has to do with the vision of the architect without having a client, and the other one has to do with a project which has a client. The idea is that you can see how many layers there is inside the identity of the quality that gives the real meaning of it. This piece of work sets out to analyze that a functional suspending city, which has been designed for almost very activity, may take place, foreseeing the future in some sectors in our lives. That's the point.
Okay, Luis.
Yes, first, Mara, can you please stop sharing your screen?
Yeah.
Then second, on one hand, I had more or less the same question as Li Xianning, the relation between the two works you presented, because one is an ideal work and the other one is a real work. But there's another little thing that I would like to ask for the first part of your presentation of the Takis Neto's ideal cities. And it's a striking relation to the arcology ideas of Paulo Soleri that he developed and built partially in Arizona. So I think it has to be taken into account that there's somebody that researched into that sense and did partially built it and left us with many drawings and ideas on this type of cities for a better future.
First of all, thank you for your comments. As you said, the idea is to find out the connection between the vision of the architect that Zenetos had and the intangible materials that Carlos Scarpa tried to design. From the other hand, I find also a connection with another project that Friedman has designed, another city, which seems to be like Zenetos.
Thank you.
So, Luis, what's next? Shall we?
I think we can open the floor for everybody to have a larger discussion. We're more or less on time. We have about an hour for to have like a round table. Mainly, we would like to hear about these ideas from the presenters, but I think we have already a question by Kevin.
Yes, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you, Luis. I would like to pick up on a comment that Mr. Li Xianning made earlier about the wishes of the client and certain requirements of a client in relation to the Brion Cemetery. And actually it makes the project a bit of a tragedy in a way, because the way the cemetery is designed, I mean, these old Italian cemetery tombs, the poorer people, the people of lower social standing, get the cheaper tombs in the middle. And on the edges, you get these little huts, these little stone tombs, where families then have shelves inside to put the remains of their relatives. Now, what Scarpa did was brilliant. He used that same form, kind of a family tomb, of a richer family, which had a tomb on the edge, as a portal that you walk through to the cemetery, to the Brion cemetery beyond. So that was really brilliant from the viewpoint of the specific context of the cemetery of San Vito di Altavole, which is where the Brion cemetery is located. But in appropriating the use of the existing cemetery and using what would be traditionally a hut, one of the stone huts, as a portal to his cemetery for the couple and the family, he failed to give back to the village of San Vito by allowing the chapel located within to be used by the other members of the community. So in that respect, it's not just the requirements of a client, I feel, that creates an architecture of quality, but our responsibility also to the bigger context which a project might sit in, especially with something as vital and as shared as a town cemetery, if that makes sense at all, Mr. Lee.
No, you don't have your micro on, Lee, micro.
Maja, you want to respond to Kevin's comments?
I agree with him. I think that Scarpa.
Mara, excuse me, can you switch on your video so that we can see you speak?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that Scarpa take under consideration the Oval Cemetery, not so much. He only designed the path and the connection between the two of them. Otherwise, his idea is brilliant. This is my comment, which has to do with the Wallon Cemetery.
Okay. Luis?
Yes, I think we can enlarge conversation. Maybe I would like to go back to question to Mara, but I would like to hear more ideas from Matsipa or Marta Peixoto, or maybe all of us thinking about the theme of this conference, quality, and also, and I think you pointed out quite well, the idea of the quality of not only what's not present there, but the social quality that I also said something about it in my initial talk. I think that quality is not only the material thing, but it has to do, and you pointed out quite well, Li Jianing, at the social quality. It's something we have to really look after it. So for me, for Matsipa and Marta Peixoto really touched upon this theme, and Maravitru went a bit more into just intangible qualities, mainly in the presentation of Zenetos, that is something that is only in plans. And most of us have heard that architecture is not there until it's not solid. But maybe we can all think and discuss about these themes. Elias, and then Wilfred, and then you direct this part, Lee.
Okay.
I
Elias.
want to, thank you, just make a quick comment that might help the conversation, continuing Luis's thought. If we're talking about social quality and trying to bring everything that we heard today together, is, I think, an underlying question that has to do with the way we judge or ask, critique, or talk about the quality of a built work of architecture, of a built piece of architecture, which lasts through time. And at some point, because it has a long duration, we know that architecture is persistent in terms of time, the context or the content may change. The inhabitants change, things change through time, and we are asked to talk about architectural quality in the whole of this conference when conditions change. So before talking specifically about social change, I think the underlying question, the deeper question of what Luis said, is how can we judge something and talk about architectural quality when it is beyond its, let's say, time frame and client and context, etc., etc. The box, the thing is still there. So I think that's for me is a crucial question.
Yeah.
Do you have any answer, Elias?
It's right that you asked me that, so we can talk more about it. I think change is necessary. Things have to adapt. So if we take the 3 parameters that Vitruvius has put before us, and they come up to the Pritzker Prize, which has them on the medal. If the aesthetic takes precedence, then things can be frozen in time. We see some architectural qualities where commodity, fairness, and delight are locked together happily, and then the aesthetic takes precedence and we have to keep it as it is. It's not the case. When things, there's this famous saying about Pessac by Le Corbusier, who, when he was asked about the changes that happened to the housing schemes, said, oh, okay, life is right, you know, people do what they do. So where do we draw the line? I think one has to accept change. New families move in, whatever. But we are called to talk about architectural quality and judge regarding to the specific, in reference to the specific kind of manipulations that are being made. How do we move from one time frame to another, from one client to a new use? We readapt things, and then what are these sometimes very crude and sometimes very fine manipulations and refinements? I think we have to focus there. I can't, I don't know if he's still amongst us. Carlos is here, Eduardo Comas, that he made a very, in the previous conference last year, a very sensitive reading of a building before and after, and the specific manipulations that and changes that took place. So I think we have to focus. And I think maybe I'm wrong, but Wilfred, you talk about yourself, that regarding this conference, your focus was always on the specific, always on the building itself and what happens to it. It's difficult to generalize and say, oh, a family moved, you should have kept Mendes Rocha House as it was, or you should or you shouldn't. You have to look at the specific kind of changes that have been made. The more we focus, the more we talk about quality. If it becomes too general, I lose it. I lose the subject. I don't know if the answer satisfies you, Liz. That's how.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Wilfred.
Thank you, Xiangning. About the issue of privacy, I think it's one of the main needs that people have. I don't believe it's really desirable to do without privacy for various reasons. And it was pointed out by Martha in her presentation. If we talk about the need for acoustic and also air movement privacy, then I think that those things are, in my view, non-negotiable. And so what Minister Rocha is actually trying to do is to say, let's equalize everybody by taking away their privacy in his house design. And so he actually comes very close to the ideals of that you see in Russian constructivist housing of the 1920s, where there was no such thing as the family as a nuclear structure, and there was very little privacy. Children were taken away, spending their time in schools and in their daycare centers and so on, and parents were working, and only in the evenings would they be reunited all together. So the ideal of doing away with privacy is an ideal that is, of course, politically and socially motivated, which I don't personally share. So, but where does it come from? It's an ideal that is, as I said, socially motivated, and it projects the architect's vision into the future or even into the present. And as Elias was saying, unfortunately, architecture has a long life, and so these things persist. And in their persistence, this lack of positive quality continues, and which is not something that necessarily everybody is going to appreciate. So from my point of view, I would say there are certain things that are non-negotiable and that represent a bad quality that needs to be, or that need to be readdressed. And by the fact that one of the daughters moves down into the servant's bedroom is a proof that this daughter was looking for privacy that she didn't have. I don't believe this argument that it was a larger bedroom space. That's one thing. But I'm sure she found a lot more relief from being released from this general upper floor sleeping and living condition to an area where she could lead her own life. So are there certain things that we would look for in house design and domestic design which are non-negotiable? And of course, this touches on a very difficult issue in contemporary architectural design, where people reserve the rights, architects reserve the right to invent, to innovate, to change, to transform, to question, to break the boundaries of things. And sometimes these are just academic exercises of breaking things for the sake of breaking things, without actually a lasting social value. Now, this might sound very conservative, but I would put it to you that the idea of non-privacy is a major problem also in other modern designs. I mean, even in Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation, where you have sliding doors between rooms. Sliding doors, we know, do not provide acoustic seals. And therefore it's anything but ideal living condition. So if we look at that and set that aside and say, what are the ideal living conditions in a domestic context? That's one general question. The other question that Zenetos raises, and I think he's an avant-gardist in various fields. Louise points out that Mara's presentation talked about visions and designs, but actually his school that he designed, the circular school in Athens from 1969, is a major a statement in terms of an innovative pedagogy. Now, in detail, it also has privacy problems because it requires sliding doors between classrooms, which do not provide acoustic seals. But he was ahead of his time in thinking about the use of other kinds of means of education, like television and things like that, which in 1969 nobody was thinking about. So I would, on the one hand, say, yeah, there are some basic things that are sine qua non in domestic conditions, and there are other things when architects have the duty and the right to try and innovate, as in the case of the school that Xenatos did. And the fact that he also looked at the city as a whole makes this figure that much more fascinating. So I would differentiate in terms of quality according to the particular context, particular functions that these buildings have to satisfy.
Thank you, Wilfred. Fernandez, I saw you raising hands, but you put down. You still want to say something?
Okay. Yes. I wanted to go back to social quality and the idea that is becoming so widespread that a project that has a purpose or works with social issues has to be awarded because of its purpose. So I think that that is happening, I think, at a certain point. So I think that it's important to understand that social quality in architecture is a way to deal with the social issues. It's a quality way to deal with it. So I bring this to the discussion because I have mixed feelings with some of the awards that are being given in a way that poverty becomes instrumental for a global North Korea. I have mixed feelings about this. For instance, Francis Kéré has been awarded with the Pritzker Prize because he's a good architect, because he's dealing with social issues in Africa. But I would like to ask Dr. Matsipa about what are her feelings, because in the other hand, it becomes like a way for this Eurocentral guilt to appease this bad conscience. I don't know. What are your feelings about this prize?
Yes. You want to answer?
Well, to be honest, I'm not a close follower of the Pritzker Prize. And it certainly hasn't made its way to Africa very often in my lifetime. But and I also want to hold off on remarking on any sort of criteria around connoisseurship in Francis Kéré's work, because that's precisely not. These are not the questions that are very central to me. But what I think is interesting about his work, and in some ways it ties to something that Joao said about, thinking from spaces outside of the privileged North, is that he's raising some very interesting questions around materials, around sustainability, around technology that are worth engaging. And it's interesting to me because it raises questions about scale, around energy. So it's interesting in that sense. But I think this idea of, designing buildings for the majority world is somehow a way to advance one's career. It just doesn't feel like something I can remark upon. I don't know how to relate to that question. I don't know if does this apply to Brazil? Does it apply to Armenia? I don't understand the geography of this question.
Luis,
Marta Peixoto was
Marta
first.
Yes.
Sorry.
I just want to maybe develop a little bit 2 or 3 points about privacy in these houses. In the first case, the case of Paulo Mendes da Rocha, the girls, it's a little bit interesting because it's a little bit controversial because the stepdaughter, this one who moved to the laundry, to the ground floor, of course, I agree totally with you. The problem is privacy. And the girl was a teenager, of course, she wants privacy. And but the case that the girl moved to the servants' bedroom is in the other house. The problem is because the first house, the Butanta house, I talked about privacy mostly. But the other, the second one, the problem is the space or lack of space. And the irony in a way is that the girl, this idea of Rodrigo Lefebvre and other architects from a group of architects, they try to do bedrooms very, very, very small. So the issue is lack of space in a way. And the daughter of Paulo Mendes da Rocha, soon after she born, she moved to this pilot. In a way, it's a very tiny space to get privacy. So this idea, I think that is very complex because I agree totally that in my personal opinion, my conservative personal opinion, they have a problem of privacy. The first house. The second one, the problem or the point is a little bit different. People, in a way, this girl was forced to move to another room because the architect proposed a life completely social life in a way. So and my point of view is that we have to deal with this question, and it's important to understand and to see all the different layers that make part of this problem. And I don't know, I see a kind of at least the critic, as far as I know, and mainly because my universe and my field in a way is the interior, the life inside the architecture. I think that sometimes in name of beauty and structure and all these so important things, this aspect sometimes is neglected in a way. That is my comment.
Thank you, Martha. Luis, your turn. You unmute.
Yeah. You know, in this idea, and I reflect on what Wilfred said before and Marta had said just now. Yes, I agree. There's the great book by Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, that it's the only way to really be one's own person and be able to produce whatever the mind or the intelligence or the sensibility of the person is to produce. But on the other hand, there's the other type of dwelling, the dwelling, and I don't want to call it primitive. It's what was being called architecture without architects or vernacular architecture. Still nowadays, in different places in Mexico, and I know in Latin America, a family lives in one room, large room, but in one room. And there's no problem for them. So maybe it's the values of actual today's civilization, what pushes individuality. I don't know. I have no question, but I wonder, because there's families that today live in one room. Maybe it's not what should be done. And of course, like I say, there's the other input of room of one's own. So it's just something that is there that one questions, because of course the Western type of life tends to have more privacy, but in former days that didn't exist. So I just leave it there, and I don't know if it's modernity or not. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luis. I see Anna. Want to say? Haven't seen it say anything, but
Yes.
Fo was first. Xiangning.
okay. Fo.
I won't take too long. This conversation about privacy is fascinating to me because it also raises the question of the body and the status of the body. And I thought that what Marta was saying about interiority was really interesting. And I think that maybe in relation to privacy, one could also have a critical perspective on transparency. Because even though other societies might have group housing, shared housing, there's all kinds of cultural codes around how bodies are read, how they inhabit space, what is the economy of gazes that is exchanged within a given space. So there's something about Marta's discussion about the interiority of these modernist or brutalist houses that I think is really fascinating. That is maybe on the one hand might be a critique of like bourgeois society, but on the other hand it might be a very explicit or the limit expression of a kind of ideal of rational man, right? This idea of like absolute transparency, everything is available, everything is open, and there are no more boundaries, and that this is maybe the world of calculability and transparency that produces this kind of strange way of inhabiting space without any of the cultural codes around how you manage odors, how you manage sound, how you manage exchanges between gazes. So maybe one of the things that needs to be brought into the conversation around transparency and privacy is also the idea that the body is culturally coded. It's not a universal body. And different societies have different ways of managing how bodies interact in a given space.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Elias, and then Anna after.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick comment. I heard Marta say a couple of times, talk about the small bedrooms. And I think the first time you actually used the word to force them to get out of the rooms. Now, I know such occasions in my country of architects who are trying to break away with the usual normal bourgeois modes of habitation in apartments and have done the same thing. It doesn't seem to work within this cultural context. I'm wondering whether in this discussion, we're also talking about a misapplied, a misguided sense of social engineering on the part of architects, that to say that we force them to live in small rooms. Of course, the body is culturally coded, as Mfo very correctly said. So are we overdoing our design work? I mean, 100 years ago, Adolf Loos talked a bit about the extent to which, in his parables, more than in his buildings, the extent to which an architect should intervene in the interior, in the domestic interior. The story of the poor rich man, I think it was called by Loos. So are we overstepping our goals?
You want to respond? Okay, Anna, it's your turn finally.
So in fact, when I raised my hand, it was before Luis' talk, and I immediately thought about Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. This is something very dear to all women, I think, because this is really a conquest from contemporary times, that women are allowed to have, you know, their own place, and this is something considered by society. And then Mofo talk about all the codes on within the body, and with several, let's say, approaches. And I thought that, in fact, this is an amazing issue, always as well following Marta Peixoto. And I'm sorry, I'm much more following the women this time, because there are some, I believe, complicities between us in this matter. And Marta Peixoto as well brought very important issues to the discussion. And of course, we think about the Glass House and Mies and the Tugendhat or the Farnsworth House and all of this. And I as well thought about, you know, the little cellular rooms of the convents, just for sleeping, and in a way, how interesting is that these were followed in La Tourette with a very, I would say, perfect scale in a way, but without any privacy in terms of acoustic. It's crazy. So and in fact, this is a very important issue in this a question of quality. It's a sensorial matter, but is that as well something that has to do with our intellectual life, our necessity of being alone, although we know that today, Luis told us that in vernacular architecture, people live together and they are perhaps happy. I don't know. The thing is that I really do need to have my, you know, my own space to keep my balance. And I think it's something that Western culture, people, and mainly women, need to be balanced. So this is, I think, a really very open mind question to go forward. And I perhaps would suggest that we go in other attempts and other schedules to think about this more deeply. I think it's very, very interesting. Body, transparency, and private matters. Thank you. No answers.
Very, very good suggestion. Maybe you could consider something, you know, related to this, you know, for the next year, right?
Okay, but with my companions, Luis, Marta, Mofo, I think we and Claudia could make some. I normally I don't like to make this thing only women, but perhaps we could start just to for a suggestion and then to open it to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Wilfred.
Thank you, Xiangning. Regarding the discussion about single rooms, I'm following on from Anna's observations. I think to cast this in some kind of very contrasting terms, in Germany, 2015, 2016, when the refugee crisis brought hundreds of thousands of people to Germany, one of the ways refugees were treated was to place them into the hangar of the former airport of Tempelhof. And they were partitions erected inside this 12-meter tall space, 2.5-meter tall partitions. So they were open to the underside of the hangar space, and there were bunk beds inside in individual rooms, so that there were potential families inside individual subdivisions. But the noise was, inescapable. There was no privacy. And clearly this was, at least that's my interpretation, was a way to dissuade people to come to Germany. That's my interpretation, okay? So, in other words, how do we treat people as individuals, or as families, or as groups, when they are mobile, in inverted commas, when they are in need for stability, when they're in need for protection, and so on. And I think that that's an extreme form of existence, and it shows, in my view, that the ideal state, maybe it's not a universal ideal state, but it's one ideal state, that you do have some sense of privacy as a form of the individual preserving the individual dignity. And I come back to this term dignity. Now, whether that dignity has to be individualized in spatial terms is another topic, right? So we can discuss that. But I also want to contrast that with an essay and a lecture that Robin Evans, the great mind in architectural theory, once talked about corridors, doors, and passages. And I think, if I remember correctly, he also spoke, at least in the lecture on the seminar, about the history of beds. There used to be a time when there were not individual beds, but the family as a whole slept in one bed. Now, that's an extreme form of family unity, if you like, but it's also an extreme form of non-privacy. And therefore, as Louise was saying, we have had different situations. There is no universality about it, because different societies have different standards. And therefore, you could say, okay, in terms of quality of the design of a domestic situation, you can take what is standard in that society and then differentiate according to what the the architects have tried to change or improve or whatever. And so one can use that as a device. And if we talk about quality, this conference is about the issue of quality, we can measure the difference in those terms.
Okay, thank you, Wilfred. Any more comments or?
Marta.
I just want to tell in this direction, Wilfred and Louise, is the other point that is important, in my opinion, is that in our so-called Western civilization, because yes, we have here in Brazil the favelas and still are here, and the situation of privacy is completely different. And now I remember a very good movie from Ettore Escola called, I just remember in Portuguese, Feios, Sujos e Malvados, but
Brutis, porci e cattivi.
é só essa. And show the life with this aspect, lack of privacy. And I remember that, as far as I know, the Western civilization lived in this way, I don't know, until maybe the beginning of the 1,200 more or less, and the necessity to close people in rooms. We're not to close people in rooms, but the necessity, nudity was not a problem. Hygiene questions or liquids were not a problem, but the problem was money. The necessity, or not money, but the possessions of one. And so the first rooms were closed for money and things, anything, possession, not for I don't know, separate bodies. No, so this is a very important thing, and I totally agree with Bo about the question of transparency. For me, it's like in a way of calling Roe and everything. This transparency and this lack of privacy are in the same point in a way.
Okay, Luis.
Yes, it's me once again, and it's a question to for Matsipa that I didn't do at the end of her presentation because I let everybody else ask. But I was wondering, because I was puzzled by, because I looked before at your PowerPoint, the luxury flats and the servants' room on the top. On one hand, when you told me they had no windows, it's kind of a, but then in Mexico, there's been places, and mainly in the Tlatelolco housing unit, where there's servants' room and people didn't have servants. They rented the rooms to full families that were living in those rooms, talking about non-privacy. And I was wondering what happened with those servants' rooms in the luxury flats. It's just curiosity, has not much to do with what we're talking here, just that a little bit, because there might be people living in those rooms.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. In my apartment building, first of all, the rooms were separated by gender, just because of the way that labor regimes worked. And in my building, those rooms have mostly been converted into storerooms. But I think that there's such an abundance of these types of rooms, and to a large extent, they are still used as servants' quarters. And depending on where the building is located, it could either be quarters for domestic servants, or it could be additional rental property for a landlord who's trying to make additional income. So I think that it's a combination. But one of the most interesting and underexplored design questions, in my view, around this is like, what is the afterlife of these spaces? With the end of apartheid, and how can one reconceptualize rooftops as spaces for inhabitation and different kinds of inhabitation? And it hasn't really moved beyond low-income housing or housing for domestic workers without any kind of design intervention that is meaningful at all. So it remains an unresolved question of legacy from the colonial era.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Luis, we should make a little conclusion. Shall I do first, and I'll leave the floor to you for the final conclusion? Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I think today we start from I think from our keynote speech, and then we have two presenters. I think we talked about the social quality. We are all architects and architectural critics. When we are dealing with more concrete and stable and reliable, physical quality, we are quite sure, but it's very difficult to raise questions about the social quality because they are always invisible and intangible. So there are a lot of questions to be addressed, like who make judgment, according to what the criteria. Does this criteria change through time? What if the status changes when designers becomes users, when visitors become owners and users? So I think what the contribution users make through, as Marta used the word, rebellions or misuse or modifications or or even total reconstruction of the building or the architecture itself. So I don't think it's very easy to have a clear answers to all those questions, but I think we'll leave it open with maybe with even more questions after this this conference. But I think this is the function of the conference organized by SICA for us to think about more about the social quality other than just simply materials, tectonics, as we architects always deal with. So this is a very, very unique moment for all of us to share these things. I would like to thank you to the presenters and keynote speakers and all the panelists here. Luisa, I think I'll stop here and leave to you for the final comments.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed what you said, what everybody said. I just want to say that we members of SICA are just part of this. The main idea, the main force here, and we have to recognize it, it's Wilfred Wong, and this time with the big help of Jose Manuel Pozo. We were trying, and that was the title of this session, is defining architectural quality. Like you said very clearly, Xiangning, we couldn't, because there's so much variation between places, spaces, needs. But I think there was one central point, that is the social, and has to deal also with interior quality in architecture. And I think that's very important. And that we're going into architecture, we're forgetting, and that I'm happy about, the cover of magazines and what makes famous architects. We're going into where people live, not only houses, schools, hospitals, theaters. Maybe we didn't talk too much about it today, about all those other buildings, because what were presented was more houses. And then with Mara, it was this ideal city. So it was a complete different dimension. But again, it's this, is what architects think, their proposal, their avant-garde ideas, but also social quality and the quality of architecture. And I think the idea of having the whole conference be on quality, on built reality, but also on intangible matters around architecture, that's what it's been driving the presentations and of course the discussions. And I'm very happy for all of you that today brought about ideas, input, and we learned so much about so many other places that I thank all of you. And if you want to just close, Wilfred.
Thank you, Louise and Xiangning, and thank you, Mfo and Marta and Mara. I think it was a wonderful, productive, and informative and inspiring set of presentations. I think you made us all think a lot about the other dimensions to the issues of not just quality, but to people's existence in space. And the difficulties that many sections of the world are experiencing. We do live in a bubble in the Northern Hemisphere. We do have this sense of privilege and authority to speak and to set agendas and to speak about certain things. And I think that your perceptions and your presentations are important correctives and expansions to this rather one-sided and limited perception of things. So thank you for very, very important presentations. And I hope that you can join us tomorrow for the concluding session, which will in some ways return to certain issues, but I think that Rahul will also expand, and maybe and Eric and Priyanka and Naomi from India, we will have this international perception, and we will have maybe a way to bring together some of the many strands that we've been talking about over the last weekend and today. So thank you, Lise, thank you, Xiangning. Good evening, Xiangning. Have a nice night. And Kevin, and have a good Saturday, everybody who's over in the Americas.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Good to
Bye.
see
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Silvia, Marta, Claudia, friends.
Okay.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye now.